The auctioneer's gavel came down like a thunderclap, and every man in Dusty Creek, Texas, fell silent. Gertrude Alden stood at the back of the crowd, her fingers twisted together so tightly that her knuckles had gone the color of bleached bone. She had not breathed in what felt like an entire minute. The summer sun of 1882 pressed down on the assembled crowd like a hot iron, and the smell of sawdust and horse sweat and cheap tobacco hung in the air like a curtain. But none of that touched her. She was staring at the man who had just stolen her future. Not stolen, bought it. Legally, fairly, with money she did not have and could never have scraped together, not in 1,000 seasons of school teaching and mending and going without. Harlan Creed stood near the front of the crowd, a wide grin splitting his leathery face beneath the brim of his hat, already reaching out to shake the auctioneer's hand. The Alden homestead, all 160 acres of it, the land her father had broken his back over for 23 years, the land her mother had died on, the land she had grown up calling her own, was now the property of Creed and Sons Land Company, purchased for a sum that made the crowd murmur with something between envy and resignation. And then something happened that nobody in Dusty Creek would stop talking about for the next decade. A voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "I'll double it." The words were quiet. They should not have silenced the crowd so completely. But the voice that spoke them carried a particular weight, the kind of authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the man behind it. Gertrude turned, and the crowd parted, and there he was. Sheriff Roy Underwood stood at the edge of the crowd with his hat pushed back just slightly on his head, his silver star catching the sunlight, his dark eyes fixed on the auctioneer with an expression that was entirely unreadable. He was not a man who spoke twice, and every person in Dusty Creek knew it. He was also not a man who had ever, in 4 years of serving as Dusty Creek's sheriff, interfered in a land sale. The crowd erupted. Harlan Creed's grin dissolved. His attorneys leaned in to whisper urgently in his ear. The auctioneer, a nervous little man named Perkins who had never presided over anything more dramatic than a horse auction, fumbled with his gavel and knocked it off the podium entirely. "Sir, the bidding was closed," Perkins squeaked. "Then open it again," Roy said simply. He still had not raised his voice. He still had not moved from where he stood. Creed turned and looked at Roy with flat, dangerous eyes. "You don't have that kind of money, Underwood. Nobody in this county does." Roy reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a folded document. He walked forward, set it on the podium, and stepped back. "Cashier's draft from First National Bank of Fort Worth," he said. "Good as gold, better." The auctioneer's hands were shaking as he unfolded the document. His eyes went wide. He looked at Creed. He looked at Roy. He looked at the paper again. The bid stands," Perkins announced, his voice cracking. "The property goes to Sheriff Underwood." Harlan Creed's face went from white to red to a particular shade of purple that Gertrude had only seen on a man once before, the day her father had told Creed he would never sell, not for any price. "This isn't over, Underwood," Creed said, low and venomous. "Not by a long stretch." Roy did not answer him. He turned, and his dark eyes found Gertrude where she stood at the back of the crowd, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes burning with something she could not have named. He walked toward her through the parting crowd, the deed in his hand. He stopped in front of her. He held it out. She stared at it. She looked up at his face. His expression was as controlled as always, that careful, guarded stillness she had come to associate with him over 3 years of living in Dusty Creek, 3 years of exchanging no more than a dozen words with the man the whole town both admired and found entirely impossible to know. He did not speak. He simply waited. With fingers that trembled, Gertrude took the deed. Roy Underwood touched the brim of his hat, turned, and walked away without a word spoken to explain himself, without a word to elaborate, without a single thing to give her any indication of what she owed him or what he wanted in return. And that, Gertrude Alden would later understand, was the moment everything in her life changed. To understand how a proud, self-contained man like Roy Underwood ended up spending the better part of his savings at a land auction on a Tuesday morning in August. You have to go back to the spring of that same year, when the first green things were pushing up through the red Texas dirt, and the trouble that had been quietly brewing in Dusty Creek for 2 years finally began to boil over. Gertrude had arrived in Dusty Creek in the spring of 1879, 3 years before that auction, accompanying her father, Edward Alden, who had come west with a land grant, a wagon full of tools, and enough stubborn optimism to fill a cathedral. Gertrude was 24 at the time, the eldest of 2 children, though her brother Thomas had stayed in Missouri where he had a wife and a dry goods store and no interest in homesteading. It was only Gertrude who came, because her father was 58 and not as strong as he once was, and because Gertrude had always been the one who stayed. She was not the kind of woman who inspired sonnets or stirred up poetic language. She was practical, direct, and possessed of a quiet stubbornness that had driven more than one person to frustration. She was tall for a woman of her era. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat when she worked outdoors, and gray eyes that her father said could read weather. She could, in fact, read weather. She could also read people, which was more useful and considerably less poetic. Within a month of arriving in Dusty Creek, she had secured a position teaching at the small schoolhouse on the edge of town, because the land would take a year to yield anything, and they needed cash income. Within 2 months, she had organized the women of the settlement into a quilting cooperative that also served as an informal information exchange, which was how she learned, 6 months after arriving, that Harlan Creed had designs on the land along Copper Creek, all of it, including the Alden homestead. Creed was not a subtle man. He was rich, well-connected in Austin, and accustomed to getting what he wanted by one means or another. He had started quietly, sending representatives to make lowball offers to the homesteaders along the creek, framing the sales as opportunities, investments, a chance to take money and move somewhere easier. When the Alden land yielded a particularly good wheat crop in the fall of 1880, Creed's interest sharpened considerably. He sent a man named Wicker to make a formal offer. Edward Alden sent Wicker back with a message that contained several words not typically used in polite society. After that, the trouble began in earnest. Fences were cut. Irrigation channels were mysteriously blocked. A section of the barn roof collapsed in suspicious circumstances because the supporting beams had been partially sawed through. One of their 2 horses went missing. These were the kinds of pressures that could grind a man down slowly, the accumulation of small disasters, each individually explainable, collectively devastating. Gertrude had seen it happen to 2 other families along the creek. The Hendersons had sold in the fall of 1880. The Pratchetts had held on until spring of 1881, and then sold the week after their well went bad. Gertrude went to the sheriff's office for the first time in January of 1881, on a morning when the temperature had dropped below freezing and her breath came out in white clouds. She had documented every incident, dates, and descriptions written in her precise schoolteacher's hand, and she laid the papers on Roy Underwood's desk with the controlled force of someone who had been holding their anger at bay for months. That was the first time she had really looked at him. She had seen him around town, of course. Everyone had. Roy Underwood had been elected sheriff of Dusty Creek County in 1878, running unopposed after the previous sheriff, a man named Garrett, had quietly departed following certain questions about his relationship with the Creed operation. Roy was 30 years old at that point, having come to Dusty Creek from somewhere east of the Pecos that he never discussed, with a reputation for being incorruptible that had preceded him by about 2 counties. He was not tall in the way that made people notice, but he was lean and quietly powerful in the way that made people step back when they hadn't intended to. His face was angular, weathered, with dark eyes that could be unnerving in their steadiness. He did not make small talk. He did not attend dances. He did not, apparently, require the same social nourishment that other humans did. He read her papers without speaking. He asked 3 precise questions. He wrote something in his own notebook. He told her he would look into it. "That's what the last sheriff said," Gertrude told him flatly. Roy looked up at her with those dark, steady eyes. "I'm not the last sheriff," he said. It was neither boastful nor defensive. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with complete conviction. She believed him, which annoyed her because she had come prepared not to. He did look into it. Over the following weeks, she became aware of him with a frequency that was surprising for a man who was not, by any account, gregarious. He appeared at the Alden property one afternoon to examine the evidence of the cut fences. He spoke to 3 men in town whose names she had mentioned in her papers. He found the missing horse at a ranch 40 miles north and returned it without fanfare. He did not report back to her directly, which irritated her immensely, but results materialized in ways she couldn't argue with. Creed's harassment slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. The message, apparently, was that the sheriff was watching, and Creed's local operatives were not enthusiastic about operating under scrutiny. In March of 1881, Gertrude brought a pie to the sheriff's office as a form of thank you, which she later described to herself as a purely practical gesture of community appreciation, and had nothing whatsoever to do with wanting an excuse to speak to the man directly. It was a dried apple pie, because that was what she had, and she had made it herself, which she mentioned preemptively, because she was not going to apologize for something she had made with her own 2 hands. Roy accepted the pie with an expression she could not read. He offered her coffee. She said yes. They sat in his office for 45 minutes while the wind rattled the window glass, and she learned almost nothing about him personally. But she found herself talking more than she had talked to anyone in months about the land, the work, her father's health which had been declining since autumn, her own stubborn conviction that she would not let Harlan Creed drive them off the place her father had given years of his life to build. Roy listened in a way that was unusual for a man. He did not offer solutions when she hadn't asked for them. He did not tell her to be reasonable. He asked questions, and when she answered them, he heard the answers. She found herself watching his hands, which were scarred and careful, wrapped around his coffee mug with a kind of deliberate attention to everything he touched. "You were somewhere before here," she said, not quite meaning to, studying the scar along his left knuckles. His eyes came up. "Most people were," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The pie was finished. The coffee was finished. She put on her coat and said, "Good evening, Sheriff." And he said, "Good evening, Miss Alden." And she walked home in the cold with her heart doing something she considered both inconvenient and entirely beside the point. The story of Roy Underwood's dark past was not a secret he kept because he was ashamed of it. It was a secret he kept because he had learned, the hard way, that the moment people knew his history, they could use it. And he had lived too long in places where people who knew your weaknesses would eventually use them against you. He had been born in 1848 in a small town in Georgia, the youngest of 3 sons. His father had been a hard man in the way that poverty and frustration make men hard, and the war had carved out whatever softness remained. Roy had been old enough to see the end of the war but too young to fight in it, which meant he had seen the devastation without the complicated weight of having participated. When the family's land was sold for taxes in 1866, the Underwoods scattered. Both his older brothers went west. Roy stayed for 4 years, working on a rebuilt railroad, learning what he needed to know about the world, which was mostly that the world was not interested in being fair, and that surviving required either adaptation or stubbornness, preferably both. He went west in 1870. He worked cattle for 3 years in Kansas, which was brutal and educational. He served briefly as a deputy in Abilene, which was more educational and only slightly less brutal. He had been in a relationship that he did not think about more than was absolutely necessary with a woman named Clara who had eventually married a banker and moved to Chicago, not because she was cruel, but because Roy had not, at the critical moment, been able to make himself offer her the life she needed. He had understood why she left. He had not understood, for a long time afterward, what the gap she left behind actually meant about him. He moved through 3 more towns in 6 years, learning the work of keeping order, developing a reputation for being impossible to bribe and difficult to threat, and occasionally right about things before anyone else noticed they were wrong. He came to Dusty Creek because it needed someone, and because he had been told it was quiet. It had been quiet. Until Creed started his campaign along Copper Creek, and until Gertrude Alden walked into his office with her papers and her gray eyes and her absolute refusal to be anything other than precisely what she was, which was someone who would not give up. He was 32 when he met her. She was 25, and he told himself on a daily basis that he was her sheriff, that his interest in her situation was professional, that he was not spending more time than strictly necessary thinking about the way she talked about the land her father loved, or the way she said exactly what she meant, or the way she had looked at him across his desk with those sharp, reading eyes that saw more than he intended to show. He had always known, not very good at lying to himself. Edward Alden died in November of 1881. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was the slow dimming of a man who had given too much of himself to work and cold and worry, and who had come to the end of his strength. He spent 2 weeks in the small bedroom of the house he had built, with Gertrude beside him, and he died on a Thursday morning with the first real snow of winter coming down outside the window. Gertrude handled the arrangements with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and she went through the first week after the burial in a state of tight control that the town recognized as grief held back by sheer will. She continued teaching. She maintained the property. She thanked the neighbors who brought food and the women from her quilting cooperative who came to sit with her, and she did not cry in front of any of them. Roy came to pay his respects on the second day after the burial, which was appropriate, because he had known Edward Alden in the way that a sheriff knows the solid citizens of his town, and he stood on the porch of the small house with his hat in his hands and said he was sorry for her loss, which he was. Genuinely. The words came out careful and true. Gertrude stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "Would you like to come in for coffee, Sheriff?" He came in. He sat at the kitchen table that Edward Alden had built by hand. He drank coffee and did not try to fill the silence with meaningless words, which was the thing she needed most at that moment. Someone who understood that silence could be a form of company rather than an absence. They sat for an hour in the early winter light, and when he left, Gertrude stood at the window and watched him ride away down the frozen road and felt something shifting in the locked-up geography of her chest, something she was not ready to look at directly. The problem of the land became critical almost immediately. Edward Alden had left no will, not formally, because he had not expected to die that winter and had not gotten around to it. A man's perpetual optimism about time. There was a complicated legal situation involving the original land grant, a small outstanding debt to a hardware supplier in Fort Worth, and the question of whether Gertrude, as an unmarried woman, had clear legal standing to assume possession of the property without her brother Thomas, who was technically the male heir under the laws of Texas in 1882. Thomas, to his credit, came from Missouri when Gertrude wrote to him. He was a decent man, steady and unimaginative, who had absolutely no interest in the land but considerable interest in ensuring the debt was paid so his own credit rating remained clean. He consulted with a lawyer in Austin, agreed that Gertrude should have the property, and signed the necessary transfer documents. He went home to Missouri in February of 1882, and that was the last anyone in Dusty Creek saw of him. What Thomas did not know, because Gertrude did not tell him, was that the lawyer in Austin had made several errors in the land transfer documents, errors that were discovered in June of 1882 by the Dusty Creek County Records clerk, a meticulous man named Hartley who took his job extremely seriously. The errors were not, on their own, necessarily catastrophic, but they created a window, a legal ambiguity that could be exploited by a man with money and legal resources, which was to say, a man like Harlan Creed. Creed's attorney discovered the documentation errors within a week of Hartley's notation. Within 2 weeks, Creed had filed a formal legal challenge to the land title. Within a month, he had arranged for the land to be put up for public auction, the mechanism being a specific provision of Texas law that allowed disputed titles to be resolved by public sale when the legal documentation was insufficiently clear. It was the law, technically. It was also the most effective trap he had ever laid, because Gertrude Alden could not afford to buy her own land back at auction, and everyone in the county knew it. Gertrude found out about the auction on a Tuesday morning in July, 6 weeks before the sale was scheduled. She received the legal notice by post, read it 3 times, and sat down at her kitchen table with the particular stillness of a person who has received a blow and is determining the extent of the damage before they allow themselves to feel it. She went to Roy's office that afternoon. He was at his desk when she came in, reading a report from the Texas Rangers about a string of cattle thefts in the neighboring county. He looked up when she entered, and something in her face made him set the report down immediately. She put the legal notice on his desk. She watched him read it. She watched his jaw tighten in the infinitesimal way that was, she had learned by then, his version of a visible emotional reaction. "This is Creed," she said. She was stating a fact, not asking a question. "Yes," he said. "Can it be challenged, the auction?" She was holding herself very still the way she did when she was fighting for control. "The legal mechanism is legitimate," Roy said carefully. "The documentation errors are real. Creed found a real weakness." He paused. "What he did with it is the corruption, but the lever he's using is legal." The silence stretched. "So I lose the land," Gertrude said. She said it very quietly, with the flat voice of someone doing arithmetic. "Not necessarily." He met her eyes. "How much capital do you have access to?" she told him. He was quiet. The number was honest and insufficient. They both knew it. "The auction will bring serious bidders," she said. "Creed will outbid everyone. He's wanted this land for 3 years." "Yes," Roy said. "Is there anything you can do?" she asked. It cost her something to ask it. She was not a woman who asked for rescue. Roy looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the thing where it revealed nothing, and she had never been more frustrated by it than she was in that moment, because she desperately needed to know what was behind it. "I'll look into it," he said. She had heard that from him before, and it had meant something. She chose to believe it meant something now. She took the legal notice back because she needed it, and she walked out of his office into the hot July afternoon, and she did not let herself look back. What Roy was looking into was something he had been building toward for 6 months, quietly and carefully, in the way he did everything, with patience that bordered on the geological. He had, over the preceding winter, developed a detailed picture of Harlan Creed's operation that went considerably beyond the fence-cutting and harassment that Gertrude had documented. Creed's land acquisition strategy along Copper Creek was part of a larger scheme that involved a fraudulent water rights contract with a cattle syndicate in San Antonio, a bribe paid to 2 members of the Austin Land Office, and what amounted to extortion of 3 smaller homesteaders who hadn't been as vocal about their troubles as Gertrude had. Roy had sent a detailed report to the Texas Rangers in June, 3 weeks before the auction was announced. He was waiting for a response. The problem was that federal intervention took time, and the auction was in 6 weeks, and the Rangers moved on their own schedule, which was deliberate and thorough and, right now, infuriatingly slow. He wrote another letter to Ranger Captain James Holloway in Austin on the evening Gertrude had come to his office, laying out the urgency with a directness that was not typical of his correspondence, because He was typically circumspect and measured in his official communications. This letter was neither. This letter said that Harlan Creed was going to complete a fraudulent land acquisition in 6 weeks, and that if the Rangers wanted the full evidence package, they needed to move faster than they currently were moving. Holloway wrote back within 2 weeks. The letter was sympathetic and detailed, and ultimately explained that while the investigation was advancing, it would not be complete before the auction date, and the Rangers could not act to stop a legally scheduled sale on the basis of an incomplete investigation. Roy read the letter on a Friday afternoon. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer. Then he sat for a long time in the still heat of his office, looking at the opposite wall, and did the arithmetic that he had been doing and refusing to complete for weeks. He had money, not a great deal by the standards of men like Creed. But he had lived simply for 12 years, and he had saved consistently, and he had made one investment in 1879 on the advice of a banker friend in Fort Worth that had returned 4 times its value by 1881. The cashier's draft he had obtained from First National Bank in Fort Worth 2 weeks before the auction had cleaned out nearly everything he had. Not quite, but nearly. He had not told anyone he was doing it. He had not asked for permission or approval. He had thought about it for 2 weeks and concluded that it was the right thing to do, not because he was trying to win anything from Gertrude, not because he expected her gratitude, but because the alternative was watching something deeply unjust happen to a person he had come to respect more than he respected most people he had encountered in his adult life. And he was not constituted to watch injustice when he had the means to prevent it. He was also not going to pretend, in the privacy of his own mind, that his feelings for Gertrude Alden were purely professional. He had been not pretending this for approximately 8 months, through a winter of shared coffee and careful conversation, and the growing, alarming recognition that she was the most compelling person he had encountered since Clara, and what he felt for her was nothing at all like what he had felt for Clara, which had been warm and comfortable and ultimately insufficient. What he felt for Gertrude was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a significant drop. He did not tell her he was planning to bid at the auction. He thought about telling her. He concluded that if he told her, she would object because she would see it as charity, which would wound her pride. And he understood her pride because he had the same kind. It was the pride of people who had learned not to ask for help because asking for help had, historically, produced disappointment. He would give her the land. Whatever happened after that was a separate matter. The auction was held on the 3rd Tuesday of August, 1882. The crowd was large by Dusty Creek standards. Perhaps 80 people gathered in the open lot beside the courthouse, which was a modest 2-room building of lime-washed stone. The morning was clear and blazing hot, and Gertrude stood at the back in a dress that was her best, a dark blue cotton with white collar, because she was not going to face this dressed in anything that suggested defeat. She had spent the morning trying to calculate if there was any conceivable way she could scrape together enough to bid competitively. There was not. She had spoken to the bank, and the bank was sympathetic and unhelpful. She had written to Thomas again, but a letter to Missouri and back took weeks she didn't have. She had sold her good horse and most of her father's tools, which had brought enough to keep her for 6 months, but not nearly enough to compete with Creed at auction. She stood at the back of the crowd and watched Harlan Creed work the front of the gathering, shaking hands and being expansive, because he had won and he knew he had won and he saw no reason not to enjoy it. His attorneys were there. 2 large men who worked for him stood slightly behind him, which was not subtle. The bidding began. Several men made opening bids, some out of genuine interest, some because they couldn't quite bring themselves not to try. Creed ran them up and knocked them back down in short order. The numbers climbed past what any of the local men could sustain, and one by one they dropped out, until there was only Creed left, and the crowd was doing the particular kind of silence that communal witnessing of an injustice produces, the silence of people who know something is wrong and cannot stop it. The auctioneer began the closing formalities, and then Roy said he would double it. Gertrude stood in her blue dress in the baking August heat and held the deed her father had dreamed over and her mother had died near, and the paper shook very slightly in her hands because she was shaking, and she was shaking because she was not as composed as she required herself to be, not at this particular moment, not with this particular thing in her hands. She looked up. Roy was already walking away through the dispersing crowd, back straight, badge catching the light, giving no indication that he had just turned her entire life inside out. Her first feeling was gratitude so profound it physically hurt. Her second feeling was something fierce and complicated and threatening, because she did not know what she owed him, and not knowing what she owed a person was a condition she found intolerable. Her third feeling was something she shut a door on immediately, because this was not the moment. Creed had moved to stand at Roy's shoulder. She couldn't hear what he said, but she could see his face, and what was on it was not the purple fury of a man who had lost a bidding war. It was something colder and more calculated. It was the look of a man reformulating his plans. That look frightened her considerably more than his anger would have. She found Roy at the end of the day at his office after most of the crowd had dispersed, and the heat had broken slightly with a wind coming from the south. She knocked on the frame of the open door and he looked up from his desk. "I need to understand what just happened," she said. She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk, which is where she always sat, and folded her hands in her lap in the way that meant she was holding herself together by choice. "I bought the land at auction," Roy said. "The deed is in your name, it's yours. You spent your savings," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That's my business," she said, and there was the flash of the stubborn fire that he had come to think of as uniquely hers. "It is absolutely my business because you did it on my behalf, and I will not be beholden to someone and not understand the terms." Something moved in his dark eyes, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "There are no terms," he said. "There are always terms," she said. "People don't spend their savings without terms." "I do," he said simply. Gertrude looked at him. The office was quiet. The late afternoon light came through the window and lay across his desk in a long gold bar. "Why?" she asked. It was the question he had been expecting and the one he was least equipped to answer, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer was not something he was comfortable stating baldly. He was not a man who stated his interior life baldly. He had spent years learning not to. Because it was the right thing to do, he said. It was true. It was also not the complete truth. Gertrude was watching him with those gray eyes that read weather. She was reading him, and he had the uncomfortable sense that she was reading more than he was showing, which was a sensation he was not accustomed to. "Roy," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name to his face, not Sheriff, not Mr. Underwood, but Roy, and the sound of it from her was different than it was from anyone else, which was information he didn't quite know what to do with. "Do you mean to tell me that you bankrupted yourself on a Tuesday morning in August purely from civic generosity, and there is absolutely nothing else behind it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I mean to tell you that the deed is yours with no conditions attached," he said carefully. "Whatever else might be behind it is not something I intend to put on you as an obligation." She absorbed this. Her hands were still folded very precisely in her lap. "That," she said slowly, "is either the most principled thing anyone has ever done for me or the most evasive answer I've ever received, and I cannot quite tell which." "Could be both," he said. The ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile either. The afternoon light was still doing its warm, slow work. She stood. She pulled on her gloves with the precise, economical movements that were characteristic of her. "I'll find a way to repay the money," she said. "That is not a negotiation, that is a statement of fact. I will find a way." "You don't need to," he said. "I need to," she said, with the particular emphasis that indicated this was a matter of her own integrity and was not actually up for discussion. She looked at him one more time at the door, and what passed between them in that moment was entirely silent and entirely clear and entirely unspeakable, and then she was gone. The trouble from Creed came faster than Roy had expected. He had anticipated a legal challenge, possibly an attempt to leverage the Rangers' investigation against him, perhaps a coordinated effort to have him removed from office through political channels in Austin, where Creed had connections. What he had not anticipated was that Creed would decide to skip the legal architecture entirely and go directly to the persuasion of fear. It started the following week. 3 of Creed's men, the large ones who had been at the auction, were seen near the Alden property 2 evenings running. Nothing happened, but their presence was a message. Roy paid them a visit and told them that he was aware of the message and that he would be watching, and the men went away. But they went away in the way that men go away when they are planning to be less visible rather than actually deterring. Then one of Roy's deputies, a young man named Amos Birch who had been with him for 2 years, came to work one morning looking white around the mouth and told Roy that he had received a visit the previous evening from a man he didn't know who had suggested that Amos might want to consider his employment options, because the sheriff of Dusty Creek might not be the sheriff for much longer. Roy listened to this with complete calm. He told Amos to write down everything the man had said and describe him in detail. He sent the description and transcript to Captain Holloway by the afternoon post. Holloway's response came back in 9 days, and it contained information that changed the shape of things considerably. The Rangers had, in the intervening weeks, completed enough of their investigation to act. They had evidence of the bribery in the Austin land office. They had testimony from one of the smaller homesteaders Creed had extorted, a man named Bowen who had sold under duress and been willing to say so on record. They were coming to Dusty Creek. Roy read this on a Saturday morning. He felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for months. He went to tell Gertrude. He had not been to the Alden property since Edward's death, not beyond the necessary professional visit. He rode out on his bay horse in the late morning, along the creek road where the cottonwoods were beginning to show the first copper of coming autumn, and he felt the strangeness of what he was riding toward, which was not just a professional visit, not anymore, and he needed to be clear about that with himself before he arrived. He was clear about it. He had been clear about it, if he was being honest, for a considerable time. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, pulling up spent plants from the summer, and she straightened and pushed a strand of hair from her face and looked at him with the focused attention she gave everything. "Rangers are coming," he said, dismounting. "They have enough to act. Creed's operation is coming down." She was quiet for a moment, taking that in. Then, with a long exhale, "How long? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Holloway is thorough. Will it hold the case against him?" "Yes," Roy said. "Bowen's testimony alone is substantial. They have documents from the Austin office. It'll hold." She nodded. She looked out over the land, at the creek glittering between its cottonwood banks, at the pale gold of the prairie grasses beyond. Her father's land. Her land now. She had her hands at her sides and her back was straight, and she was, Roy thought, one of the finest things he had ever had the privilege of looking at, not because of what she looked like but because of what she was. "Come in," she said. "I have coffee." He came in. He hung his hat on the peg by the door where Edward's hat used to hang and sat at the kitchen table, and she set coffee in front of him and stood on the other side of the table and looked at him. "Roy," she said, in the same way she had said it in his office, the way that made the room smaller and the afternoon quieter, "I have been thinking about Tuesday." "The auction," he said. "The auction," she agreed. "And what you said after." He waited. He was good at waiting. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am not a woman who falls easily. I think most people would tell you that. I am not easy to know, and I am not easy to move, and I have been living for 3 years in this place with my father and my work, and I have been sufficient to myself, and I have been, I think, glad of it." She paused. "And I also think that something has been happening that I have been calling something else for a considerable time because it was more convenient." Roy's hands were around his coffee mug. He did not move. "What have you been calling it?" he asked. Professional respect, she said, very slightly wry. Community appreciation, civic solidarity, a pause, things that sounded more appropriate than the actual truth. Which is, he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table with her gray eyes that saw everything. That you are the person I think about when I'm not talking to you, she said, simply and directly, because she was incapable of being otherwise. And that I have been trying to find a reason why that's inconvenient since approximately January. The kitchen was very quiet. The cottonwoods moved in the wind outside. Roy set down his coffee mug. He stood up and came around the table, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that he could see the controlled steadiness in her face, the slight effort it cost her to be this direct about something this important. His hand came up and touched her face, just the line of her cheek, careful as he was with everything. I have been in love with you since February, he said. Approximately. I am not a man who says that lightly. I know you're not, she said. I wasn't going to say it if you didn't want to hear it, he said. I was not going to put that on you. That, she said, is either the most principled thing I've ever heard or the most exasperating, and currently it's both. He laughed. It was a sound that clearly surprised them both, because he was not a man who laughed easily, and it was genuine and warm, and it changed his face in a way she had never seen, and she felt something unlock completely in her chest. Gertrude, he said. Roy, she said. He kissed her, and it was careful, and then it was not careful at all. And outside the cottonwoods kept moving in the wind, and the creek kept running, and the late morning light came through the window and found them there. And neither of them was thinking about anything but the complete extraordinary fact of this, that two people who had been not quite admitting something to themselves for the better part of a year had finally, mutually, and without ceremony, admitted it. When they drew back, she was slightly breathless and looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face, which was something unguarded and vivid. I should tell you things, he said, about where I came from. About before. Yes, she said, and I should tell you things later. She glanced at the window. The Rangers are coming in 2 weeks, 3 possibly. Then we have time, she said. Tell me at dinner. Are you inviting me to dinner? He asked. I am inviting you to dinner, she said with great dignity. On Thursday you will come here and I will cook and we will talk. Thursday, he said. He came for dinner on Thursday. He came for dinner on the following Thursday as well. On the Thursday after that, he told her about Georgia and the railroad and Clara, and the long strange geography of 12 years moving through the West toward a town he hadn't known was going to be the last town he moved to. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she told him about her mother's death when she was 16 and Thomas's departure and the years of being the practical one, the one who stayed, the one who organized and documented and held things together and had somewhere along the way forgotten to leave room for herself. We are, she said, quite similar in certain respects. In the ones that matter, he agreed. Captain Holloway and 2 Texas Rangers arrived in Dusty Creek on the 1st of September, 1882. The arrest of Harlan Creed was accomplished on a Tuesday morning, which Roy noted privately had a certain symmetry. Creed's attorneys made a great deal of noise. Creed himself was surprisingly quiet, which Roy thought was the behavior of a man who knew the weight of the evidence against him. 2 of his men were arrested on related charges. The Austin Land Office personnel involved were dealt with through federal channels. It was not a single dramatic moment so much as the methodical unraveling of a criminal enterprise by people who had built an airtight case, which was, in Roy's experience, how justice actually worked when it worked. The Bowen family got their money back from a civil proceeding. The Henderson family, who had sold to Creed 2 years earlier and moved to San Antonio, received a settlement. The land along Copper Creek was permanently cleared of Creed's claims. Gertrude's title to the Alden property was confirmed, clean and uncontested, in the county records. Roy was standing on the steps of the courthouse when it was done, watching Holloway and his Rangers ride out, and Gertrude appeared beside him, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. It's over, she said. This part of it, he said. She looked up at him. What's the next part? He turned to face her, right there on the courthouse steps in front of whoever happened to be passing on the street of Dusty Creek, which was not his usual instinct because he was a private man. But some things were not well served by being private. I'd like to marry you, he said, if you're willing to consider it. I'm not a rich man, particularly not at present, and I am not always easy to know, and I spend considerable time in situations you wouldn't necessarily choose for the person you love. But I would be a faithful man and an honest one, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of someone as fine as you are. Gertrude looked at him for a long moment in the September morning light, with the sounds of Dusty Creek going on around them, and he waited, because he was very good at waiting. Roy Underwood, she said, you spent your life savings at a land auction and handed me a deed without a word, and then told me there were no terms. I think I've had considerable evidence of your character. Is that a yes? He asked. That is a very definitive yes, she said. He smiled, full and real, the smile she had been collecting instances of since February, and she reached up and straightened his collar, the gesture small and intimate and entirely theirs. They were married in October of 1882, in the small church on Dusty Creek's Main Street, on a Saturday morning when the cottonwoods were fully gold, and the sky was the particular blue that belongs to Texas autumn. The ceremony was performed by Pastor Elias Croft, who had known Gertrude since she arrived in town, and who delivered a homily that was, for once, quite short, because he was perceptive enough to know that neither of the people standing before him required a great deal of instructing in the nature of commitment. The women of the quilting cooperative organized a reception in the community hall. There was a fiddle player and a caller for dancing, and food enough for 3 times the people present. Roy danced, which surprised people who had never seen him dance, because he was not bad at it, not performatively skilled but quiet and sure in the way he was quiet and sure in everything. He danced with Gertrude twice, and the second time he pulled her a fraction closer than was strictly necessary, and she did not pull away. Are you happy? She asked him quietly under the sound of the music. Yes, he said. It was a short answer, but the way he said it was not short. It was full and complete. Good, she said. So am I. They lived in the Alden house because it was the logical choice. The property was Gertrude's, and it was larger than Roy's small rental in town. Roy rode to work each morning, which was a 40-minute ride, and he did it without complaint because it was what the situation required. By spring, they had built an addition to the east side of the house, a proper bedroom with a window that faced the creek, which Roy built himself with help from a neighboring farmer named Caldwell, who was handy with timber framing. Gertrude supervised the window placement with the focused authority of someone who had very specific opinions about morning light. Roy recovered his savings slower than he had spent them, because a sheriff's salary in rural Texas in 1882 was not lavish. Gertrude continued teaching through the fall, and the school paid her $40 a month, which she considered an argument she had won against anyone who thought a woman's income was insignificant. They were not rich. They were stable, and they were careful, and they were building something. What they were building was a life that had the texture of a real life, which included arguments and silences, and the daily work of understanding another person's interior landscape. They argued about money twice, once seriously in February of 1883 when a fence repair cost more than they had budgeted, and Roy's response to financial stress, which was to go quiet and work longer hours, collided with Gertrude's response to the same stress, which was to want to talk it through methodically and immediately. They worked it out over a Sunday dinner, not without friction, but with the determination of 2 people who had decided to be honest with each other as a matter of principle. They argued about Roy's habit of taking the most dangerous duties himself rather than delegating them to his deputies. This was a more persistent argument. Gertrude understood the source of it, his sense of responsibility, his unwillingness to put men under his command in danger he could face himself, and she respected the principle while objecting strenuously to its application. "You are not expendable," she told him, flat and direct, after he came home from a difficult situation involving a violent cattle dispute with a cut on his forearm that he had mentioned only by way of explaining why he was late for dinner. "I'm aware," he said. "You do not behave as though you're aware," she said. "You behave as though your own safety is an afterthought." "I was careful," he said. "Roy," she sat across from him at the kitchen table and looked at him with the full weight of her attention. "I need you to understand that this matters to me, not as a complaint, as a statement of fact. You matter to me, and I will not be reasonable about your safety because it is not a reasonable thing to be calm about." Something in his face shifted. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I hear you," he said. "I'll be more careful." "That is a promise," she said. "That is a promise," he agreed. He was genuinely more careful after that. Not reckless careful, not in a way that compromised his ability to do his job, but with the small adjustments of a man who has begun to understand that his own life is not only his own. In the spring of 1883, Gertrude told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before he left for work, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the particular directness she brought to every significant statement. Roy sat very still for a moment, and then he stood up and came around the table and held her carefully, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and for the first time in a very long time she allowed herself to simply be held without organizing or managing or holding herself together by will, and it was, she decided, one of the finest feelings she had experienced in her adult life. "Are you frightened?" he asked her against her hair. "Some," she admitted. "You?" "Considerably," he said. They were both honest, and then they were both laughing quietly, which was also honest. The baby arrived in November of 1883, on a cold Tuesday morning, which Roy noted privately had become a significant day of the week in his life. Their son was born with a full head of dark hair and the somewhat outraged expression of someone interrupted from something important. They named him Edward Thomas, after her father and her brother, which pleased Thomas considerably when they wrote to him, and which Gertrude thought her father would have been quietly gratified by. Roy sat beside the bed in the lamplight on the evening of his son's birth and held the small weight of him, and was entirely undone by it in a way he would not have predicted, in a way that was nothing like any preparation he could have made. He looked at Gertrude, who was exhausted and luminous and watching him with the expression she kept specifically for moments she wanted to remember. "Hello, Edward," Roy said quietly to the dark-haired baby. "I have some things to tell you about this place." Gertrude reached out and touched Roy's hand. "He'll learn from watching you," she said. "That'll be enough." They were, Dusty Creek agreed, a formidable pair. The town had watched the whole trajectory of them with the invested attention that small communities bring to the lives of their prominent citizens, and the general consensus was that Roy Underwood, who had always been respected and somewhat unknowable, had become considerably more human in the past year, and that this was entirely to Gertrude Alden's credit, though no one had the nerve to say it to his face. The women of the quilting cooperative, who were Gertrude's people and knew her better, thought the exchange went in both directions, and that Gertrude, who had always been formidable and somewhat solitary, had become warmer, or rather that the warmth she'd always had but rarely shown had found its way to the surface. Roy served another 3 years as sheriff, through 1885, in which time he oversaw the resolution of 3 significant disputes, helped negotiate a water rights agreement between the ranchers along Copper Creek that prevented what might have become a serious conflict, and personally apprehended a man wanted in 2 counties for fraud, which he did quietly and without drama, which was characteristic. The Rangers regarded him highly. The town respected him completely. In 1885, he made the decision not to stand for re-election. The decision was not impulsive. He had been thinking about it for a year, since Edward was walking and talking and beginning to understand the world in the way that children start to do around that age, with a directness and wonder that Roy found profoundly interesting. He talked to Gertrude about it over several evenings in the winter of 1884 to 1885. In the careful way they talked about significant things, which was fully and with all arguments present. "What would you do?" she asked him, not objecting, genuinely curious. "Farm," he said, "properly. I know enough to do it well. The property is large enough that with proper management it could sustain us without teaching income." She was quiet, considering. "You would miss the work," she said. "Some of it," he admitted, "not all of it. We would need to hire someone," she said, "at least seasonally." "I have 3 men in mind," he said. He had naturally already thought about this. She smiled. It was the smile she kept for moments when he was being completely himself, which was usually very prepared. "Of course you do," she said. "All right. What about the county? Do you have someone in mind for your replacement?" He did. His deputy, Amos Birch, had grown considerably in 4 years and had the instincts for the work. Roy spent the last year of his tenure training Amos with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else, and when Amos was elected sheriff in November of 1885, running essentially unopposed, Roy felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has left something in good order. He handed over the badge on the 1st of January, 1886, in a small ceremony that he kept as brief as possible because he was not comfortable with ceremony. He walked home, which was 40 minutes in the January cold, because he found the walk useful for thinking. Gertrude was in the kitchen when he came in, with Edward on her hip, and she looked at him without the badge and said simply, "Welcome home." He took his son from her arms and said, "Thank you," and meant it in every possible sense of the phrase. The farming years were good ones, busy in a different way than the sheriffing years had been, physical and seasonal and deeply tied to the land they were working. Roy had learned enough in Kansas to be a competent farmer and was disciplined enough to become a good one. Gertrude, who had been farming in some capacity since she was 12, was his equal and frequently his teacher in the practical work, which he found not remotely surprising and considerably useful. They worked side by side in the planting seasons and the harvests, in the particular partnership of people who trust each other's competence completely. The Copper Creek Cooperative that Roy had helped establish continued to benefit the whole community of farms along the creek, and the Underwood land, with its good soil and reliable water access, produced consistently enough to provide stability through several difficult seasons that affected less fortunate farms in the county. In the spring of 1887, Gertrude was expecting their second child, and this time she was less frightened and more prepared, and Roy was less frightened and equally prepared, which was a function of experience. Their second son arrived in October of 1887. They named him James, for Captain Holloway, who had become a genuine friend in the years since the Creed case, and who came to Dusty Creek twice a year to hunt and drink coffee and argue about the state of Texas law with Roy, which were the best conversations Roy could remember having in a long time. James Underwood arrived with red hair, which was entirely from Gertrude's line and which Roy regarded with profound curiosity, and with a temperament that was louder and more immediately expressive than his brother's, which would continue to be the case throughout his life. Edward, at 4, accepted his brother with the careful, analytical interest of a small person studying something new. His first assessment, delivered to his father, was that the baby was very loud and quite small, but probably all right. Roy agreed that this seemed accurate. The boys grew up on the Alden land, which had become so thoroughly the Underwood land by 1888 that no one called it anything but the Underwood place, though Gertrude sometimes, privately, called it by her father's name, because it was how she carried him. They grew up in the house their grandfather had built and their parents had extended, with the creek and the cottonwoods and the wide Texas sky as their particular world. And they grew up watching a mother and father who worked together and argued sometimes and laughed often and touched each other with the casual, daily tenderness of people who have been genuinely known by another person, and have not found it wanting. Thomas came from Missouri to visit in the summer of 1888 with his wife Sarah and their 2 daughters, and the house was full for 2 weeks in a way it had never been before. Thomas walked the land with Roy and said, honestly and without sentimentality, that their father would have been glad to see it in such hands. He meant the land. Both men understood he also meant Gertrude. They shook hands at the end of his visit in the way that men do when they have reached a mutual respect without many words, and Thomas went home to Missouri with the look of a man who has confirmed something he needed to know. By 1889, the Underwood property was one of the more prosperous small farms along Copper Creek, not because Roy and Gertrude had great luck, but because they worked hard and thought carefully and made good decisions, and looked after their neighbors in the practical, unsentimental ways that actually matter. They had added a second barn by 1888. They had a milk cow and a dozen chickens, and a kitchen garden that Gertrude managed with the organizational precision she brought to everything. They had 2 horses, a working pair named August and September, names Edward had chosen at age 5 and which had stuck. In the spring of 1890, their daughter was born, the 3rd child and the first girl. They named her Clara, which was Roy's choice, offered quietly one evening, and Gertrude had looked at him across the lamp and understood what it meant, because she knew his history by then in the complete way that years of honest conversation produces, and she said yes, that was a good name. The Clara who had left Roy was not a villain in his story, only a person who had needed something he hadn't been able to give her at that time, and naming his daughter after her was a way of carrying that part of his life without weight. Clara Underwood arrived with gray eyes that were unmistakably her mother's, and a temperament that combined the stubbornness of both parents, in a concentration that surprised no one who knew the family and would, Gertrude predicted, be formidable in any direction she chose to apply it. Roy held his daughter in the first hour of her life, and felt the same profound undoing he had felt with each of his sons, not diminished by repetition, but somehow clarified by it. The understanding that this particular capacity he had thought himself incapable of having, the capacity to be completely and helplessly in love with the specific human beings in front of him, was apparently not finite. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has your expression," Gertrude said from the pillow where she was watching him with their daughter. "That considering look as if she's already deciding something." "She probably is," he agreed. Gertrude laughed softly. "God help us." The story of what Roy Underwood had done at the land auction had become, by 1890, one of the standard pieces of Dusty Creek oral history. People told it at the general store and at the church social and around tables in the Copper Creek saloon, and over the years it acquired the small embellishments that all local legends acquire, the crowd growing larger, the silence after the gavel growing more portentous, Roy's expression becoming more dramatically inscrutable depending on who was telling it. Roy, when people mentioned it to him, which they occasionally did, usually said something minimal and changed the subject, because it was not a story he thought required embellishment. He knew what it was. It was a Tuesday morning in August when he had the means to prevent an injustice and chose to use them, and everything that followed was a consequence of that choice, which he would make the same way 1,000 times without hesitation. Gertrude, when people mentioned it to her, usually said that the most confusing morning of her life had produced the best thing in it, and then she would say something practical about what she needed from the store, because she was not given to extended sentiment in public. In private, she had said it to Roy once, differently. They were sitting on the porch in the late summer of 1889, after the boys were in bed, in the particular quiet of a Texas evening when the heat has broken and the crickets have started up and the stars are beginning to appear in numbers that are genuinely humbling. Roy had a cup of coffee. Gertrude had her mending, though she wasn't really doing it. "I think about that morning sometimes," she said. "The auction." He was quiet, listening in the way he always listened. "I stood there with that deed in my hands," she said, and I didn't know whether to cry from relief or from frustration because I didn't understand what you wanted. And you just walked away." She paused. "It was the most infuriating and the most remarkable thing anyone had ever done for me." "I wasn't trying to be remarkable," he said. "I know," she said. "That was why it was." He looked at her in the starlight. She was 43 this year, and she was more herself than she had ever been, which was to say that the years had refined rather than diminished her, worn away the brittle edges that anxiety and responsibility had produced and left the genuine thing underneath, which was someone clear and strong and still capable of surprising him. He had learned after 8 years that this would not stop, that she would continue to surprise him as long as they were in each other's company, and the prospect of this pleased him in a way he did not try to articulate. "I didn't know that morning that you would say yes," he said. "I thought there was a reasonable chance you would simply say thank you and we would go on as we had been." "I thought about it," she admitted. "I know," he said. "I could tell." "Could you?" She looked at him with some interest. "You had the expression you get when you're calculating something," he said. "You were deciding whether to be angry with me." She laughed, which was a sound that still did the same thing to him it had always done. "I was," she confirmed. "The pride of it, being given something that's significant by someone who then didn't stay to explain himself. It was extraordinarily difficult to accept gracefully." "You managed," he said. "I did," she agreed, "because it turned out you were worth the difficulty." She set down her mending and leaned slightly against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and they sat in the warm summer dark. On the porch of the house her father had built on the land she had almost lost and now would never lose, and the sounds of the evening filled the comfortable silence between them. "Roy," she said after a while. Are you happy?" she asked. It was the question she had asked him on their wedding day, dancing in the community hall. "Completely," he said, the same as he had always said, with the same fullness that was not a short answer at all but the longest one he knew how to give. She pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment. "Good," she said. "So am I." The years that followed moved with the kind of rhythm that is only beautiful in retrospect, or perhaps in the living of it, when you are paying the right kind of attention. The 3 Underwood children grew up and became themselves in the way that children of good parents do, shaped by their upbringing but not constrained by it. Edward, studious and precise, took to books and eventually went to study law in Austin, which pleased both his parents for different reasons. James, louder and more adventurous, became a rancher on land south of Dusty Creek that he had saved for since he was 14. Clara, with her gray eyes and her double inheritance of stubbornness, became a teacher, and a very good one, which Gertrude considered entirely appropriate, and Roy considered entirely predictable from the moment she first argued him into letting her have a second piece of pie at the age of 5. By 1895, Dusty Creek had grown considerably, as Texas continued to grow, and the Underwood farm had expanded and been improved, and was well established as a sound operation that required good management but not desperation. Roy and Gertrude were 50 and 49 respectively, and healthy, and still in the business of knowing each other, which remained an interesting occupation. Amos Birch had served as sheriff for 10 years with distinction. The Creed case, Roy's last significant act as sheriff, had effectively cleaned out the worst of the corrupt land speculation in the county, and Dusty Creek had developed in directions that were more equitable, not without difficulty, because equitable development was never without difficulty, but with fewer men like Creed operating in the darkness of legal gray areas, because the light Roy had shone on that particular form of corruption had made it more hazardous. The legal injustices that had enabled Creed in the first place, the documentation gaps, the corruption in the land office, the exploitation of homesteaders through technical legal mechanisms, had been addressed in part through the Creed case, which had produced both prosecutions and reform. Not enough reform, not as much as should have happened, because justice in 1882 Texas moved slowly and incompletely for many people, but the specific mechanisms Creed had used were closed. Roy and Gertrude talked about this sometimes, in the evenings, in the way they talked about everything important, directly and honestly, and without either of them pretending the world was simpler than it was. They had seen families with less protection than the Aldens had lose everything through the same processes Creed had used, and those families had not had a sheriff with savings to spend at the auction. This was a fact Gertrude had never stopped being aware of, even in her gratitude, even in her happiness. "What I had," she said once, "was luck. Not just your doing, but luck that it was you here in that office when all of this happened." "You also had persistence," he said. "Other families were persistent," she said. "Yes," he said, because it was true. "I want to do something about that," she said. He looked at her with his eyes that had always seen her clearly. "What are you thinking?" What she was thinking became, over the following year, a practical effort that was characteristic of her. A cooperative legal fund, established among the Copper Creek homesteaders, that could be drawn on by any member family facing a legal challenge to their land title. It was not a complicated idea. It was a straightforward, practical response to a real problem, the kind of thing that made a tangible difference to actual people, which was what she cared about. Roy helped her structure it legally, drawing on Edward's growing knowledge of Texas law. James contributed money from his first successful cattle season. Several of the other Copper Creek farmers joined. It was not a grand gesture. It was the thing that followed a grand gesture. The slower, harder, more important work of making sure the next family along the creek was not standing at the back of an auction with no one to act for them. Roy watched her build it and felt the thing he always felt when he watched her work, which was something he had described to himself in various ways over the years, and which always came back to the same simple understanding, that she was remarkable, and he was not going to stop noticing it. In the fall of 1896, on a Tuesday morning in August, because some things have their own gravitational calendar, Roy Underwood walked into the kitchen of the house on the Alden land, the house that was now entirely their house, built upon and extended and lived into its corners, and found his wife standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the creek where the cottonwoods were still mostly green, with the first suggestion of gold just beginning at the tips. She heard him come in and turned her head, and she smiled at him, the full warm smile that she had been giving him exclusively for 14 years, the one that still, reliably, made him entirely glad to be alive. He poured his own coffee. He stood beside her at the window. "You know," he said, looking out at the creek, "I've been thinking." "A regular occurrence," she said. "About Tuesdays in August," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was doing what it always did in late summer, that particular gold that belongs to the end of things and the beginning of others. 14 years, she said. 14 years, he agreed. And I would do it again the same way, every Tuesday, every August. Every year. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm, the way they stood sometimes at this window when the morning was quiet. "The auction," she said, "or the everything after?" "Both," he said, "but especially the everything after." She was quiet for a comfortable moment, the way she could be quiet with him in a way she had never been quiet with anyone else, because silence with Roy had never been absence but presence. "Roy," she said. "Gertrude," he said. "I love you," she said. It was not something she said carelessly. She said it the way she did everything, with intention, with full awareness of what the words cost and what they were worth. "I love you in the way that I'm a better version of myself than I would have been without you. And I know that's a complicated thing to say to someone, but it's the most honest version of it I have." He set down his coffee. He turned to face her and took her face in his scarred and careful hands, the way he had that afternoon in her kitchen in 1882 when everything had shifted between them. "I love you," he said, "in the way that this is the only place I have ever in my life felt that I was exactly where I was supposed to be." She put her hands over his. The cottonwoods moved outside. The creek ran. The morning held them. "Well then," she said softly, "here we are." "Here we are," he said, and they were. On the land they had fought for and kept and built upon. In the house that was full of the evidence of their life together, the books and the tools and the children's old drawings still pinned above the kitchen table, the list of farm tasks in Gertrude's precise hand, Roy's hat on the peg by the door. With everything they had survived and everything they had built and everything they were still, steadily, becoming. A proud man had outbid every competitor at an auction and handed a woman a deed without a word, because he believed in justice and because he loved her, and the years that followed had been the answer to both of those things. A life built on a foundation that held, because the people who built it were the kind of people who held. There are stories that end with the kiss, the gesture, the single dramatic moment. This story began with one. It did not end there. It ended here on an August morning with coffee and cottonwoods, with gray eyes that had always read whether reading something they would never stop finding new in, with scarred and careful hands holding what was most worth holding, with the creek running on the land that was theirs and always would be, and with two people who had earned each other, standing together in the quiet of a morning that was exactly what they had built it to be. Perfect. Complete. Wholly, finally home.